Hi, this is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, from the Bayit, where we are recording for webyeshiva.org, and we are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We are getting very close to the end of the Sefer, fortunately, or unfortunately, because we don't want this to end. And we are going to be doing chapter 52 today. Now, chapter 52 is a deceptively short chapter. And I say deceptively because I think that there's a lot of important information. Remember, the Rambam had said that starting from chapter 51, he's not going to be introducing any new information. This is really just a summation, a review, a repackaging of everything that he said up until now in this Sefer. And chapter 52 would fit into that as well. But I think that it's really a continuation of some of the ideas, some of perhaps the radical ideas that the Rambam had mentioned in chapter 51 about the role of physical mitzvot in the vitally important connection that every Jew should strive to have with God. Normally, we think about the performance of the mitzvot as sort of the sine qua non of what it is that a Jew is supposed to do. But throughout this work, the Rambam, as the philosopher, has also taught us that really intellectual bonding with Hashem through this bilateral process of God overflowing of his intellect down into our world, and man perfecting his intellect in order to be able to bond with that overflow of intellect, that is what creates the devekut, the attachment, the bond, the unity with God. And that is the key to really the ultimate worship. It is also the key to immortality. And the Rambam is going to continue with this theme when talking about Yirat Hashem, the fear of God, and Ahavat Hashem, and the love of God in this chapter. We talk about Yirah and Ahava as two different sides of the same coin. The sort of dichotomous nature in how we're supposed to serve Hashem, fear being the thing that sort of keeps God at a distance, and ahava being that thing, love of God, making God as close as possible to ourselves. And there's always that tension between yirah and ahava, between fear and love, that maintains this very holy type of relationship. The Rambam's going to introduce us to something that I don't believe is prevalent in a lot of other texts that discuss the ideas of yirah and ahava. So I've shared my screen. This handout, which is just really an outline of the chapter, it's a short chapter, as I said, you can always download in the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it's also available at webyeshiva.org in the course description for chapter 52, which we're studying today. Now, if you wanted to follow along, it's in the Pines edition on page 629. And the Rambam, just as by way of introduction, the Rambam continues his theme from chapter 51, that the ultimate attachment to God is through a bilateral process of divine intellect overflowing into man's world and man perfecting his intellect to meet that overflowing intellect and bond with it. This is the ultimate devekut and the most that man can hope for in Rambam's depiction of an ultimately it is the most that man can hope for in the Rambam's depiction of an ultimately transcendent God. Let's be very clear. When the Rambam talks about having a bond with God, God is an ultimately transcendent being. There's no way for a human being to connect with God in the level that is described in some of our Hasidic and mystical literature. For the Rambam, because God is that ultimately transcendent being, the only way that we can bond with God is by connecting with that overflow of divine intellect through that entity which many philosophical texts call the Seichel HaPoel, or the active intellect. We've talked many times about that entity, and it's not something that we should get bogged down as far as terminology. But it is necessary to know that for the Rambam, the mortal human being cannot bond with God himself, qua God himself, but rather man bonds with God through that overflow of divine intellect. In this chapter, the Rambam will delineate between two forms of worship, fear, yirah, and love, ahava, of God. So let's get started. We all understand that human beings behave differently when they are in the presence of important people from the way they behave when they are in the privacy of their own home. And that's really how he starts the chapter, is that if you know that you're about to be in the company of someone important, you dress differently, you speak differently, your bodily mannerisms are different as well. If someone wishes to reach human perfection and be a true man of God, he must make himself aware of God's omnipresence with him. This is not a this is not a fiction, says the Rambam. This is a reality. Because of this overflow of divine intellect and divine influence into our world, a person is always in the presence of God. This is far greater than being in the presence of even David and Solomon. This king who cleaves to him and accompanies him is the intellect that overflows toward us and is the bond between us and him. That's a direct quote from the text of this chapter. Now, the Rambam then points out that this bond is bilateral, in that just as we comprehend him by the great light of that intellectual overflow, as it says in Psalms, Ki imecho makor chayim, that with you God is the source of life, ba'orecha nir'eh or, that through your light, which means this, the word or, according to the Rambam, means that overflow of intellect that comes from God, ba'orecha nir'eh or, we have an apprehension, we have an understanding. Human beings are capable of reaching intellectual heights by connecting with that divine overflow. And of course, this is something that we've discussed in the past, that this is the belief of many medieval philosophers, that human beings are capable of having a eureka moment. That is to say, quite literally, that a person works very hard with his intellectual contemplations, and then all of a sudden, through connecting with an external intellectual overflow that comes from heaven, they are immediately and instantaneously endowed with some burst of inspiration by virtue of the fact that they have connected with, or they've plugged into something that goes well beyond their own intellect. And that's how people are able to have inspirational thoughts. So that's be'orecha nir'eh or, that through your light, through that divine overflow, we are capable of having those bursts of light and seeing that light. But at the very same time, says the Rambam, it's a bilateral process. We must also be aware that God scrutinizes us by that very same light and is therefore always with us. From the Rambam's perspective, God is ultimately transcendent, but because he allows his intellect to overflow into our world, that is the vehicle whereby God is omniscient. God is constantly knowing and aware of what is going on in our world. This is unlike what many of the philosophers of the Rambam's time believed, that God, by nature, by dint of his transcendence, is incapable of inserting his knowledge into our world, because our world is transitory, it is given to time and space, and God is above all that, and therefore God is completely unaware of what is going on, what is transpiring in our four-dimensional existence. However, Judaism asserts differently, and the way that the Rambam presents it is that it is through divine intellect, not God himself, but an overflow or an emanation of himself coming into our world that allows God to be completely aware of everything that is going on. And it thus says in the book of Jeremiah, Im yisater ish, and this is in chapter 23, Im yisater ish bamistarim va'ani lo erenunu Hashem. Is it possible that a person can hide in the best hiding place, and I will not see him, says God? Halo et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ani malei nu'um Hashem. For am I not do I not completely fill and occupy all of heaven and earth, says God. Now, point number two. So the first point that the Rambam wants to make in this chapter is that there is a bilateral process of man attaining divine intellect, but also at the same time realizing that just as man discovers God through that connection, God discovers man through that very connection, and God is completely aware of everything that is going on. Now, the reason why that's important is because the more a person contemplates that idea, the more that a person is filled with that sense of I must maintain my dignity. I am very nervous or aware that I am being watched, and this keeps my behavior in control. This is how the Rambam is leading up to a definition of what Yirat Hashem truly is, an awareness, a constant awareness of being in God's presence. And that's what instills a person with Yirat Hashem. Now, let's go on to the second point. Perfect men who understand this also understand that this is an ontological reality, not a conjuring of the imagination. Now, you can sometimes play tricks with your mind and try to convince yourself that someone is watching you at this very moment. That would be a figment of your imagination. That's, neurotic people sometimes feel that they're being watched and they're paranoid because no one is watching them. The difference here is that a truly wise person recognizes that through God's creation and structuring of his universe, he is constantly mindful of what is going on, and therefore he is completely aware of this as being a truism, not just a figment or a creation of a paranoid mind. And this brings them to a great sense of shame and humility at all times, as well as a great reverence for God. It also alters their behavior to the point where the way they behave in the toilet and during the intimate times with their wives even changes. If you know that every time you walk into the washroom, God is present and watching you, you may not be so quick to just, let everything out. And the same thing, even in the most intimate moments when one is with his wife in the bedroom. Regarding behavior with one's wife, one sage was known to be, in the terminology of the Gemara, megala tefach umechasa tefach. He would reveal one cubit and would conceal one cubit. Now, what does that exactly mean? So there's a few different interpretations, but we'll go with the interpretation of the Ritva, which seems to be the way the Rambam is understanding it, is that even in the bedroom, there was a sense of modesty in that when uncovering his wife, taking off her nightgown, he would only partially reveal her. Megala tefach, he would reveal one cubit of her body, but he would also conceal another cubit of her body. There are other interpretations as well, which we won't go into now, but I think that for purposes of modesty, that's what the Rambam is referring to. A person feels a sense of Hashem is in the bedroom with me. I can't just completely give in to my desires with complete abandon, right? Now, of course, this has been distorted, by people who want to make jokes about the nature of the Jewish people, and they talk about the mitzvah sheet and things like that. Whether or not that's a true phenomenon or not is irrelevant, but the point is that the principle of having a sense of modesty, even in the most intimate of moments with one's wife, is based on the principle of God is present at every single moment of my life, whether I'm in the bathroom or whether I'm in the bedroom. Regarding bathroom behavior, the rabbi said in Tractate Brachot, Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, Ezahu Tsanua, what is the definition of a modest human being? Zahanifne balayla kederch shenifne biyom. It is a person who defecates during the nighttime in the same way that he defecates during the day. And of course, what this means is that if you need to relieve yourself during the day, you're going to find a place of privacy. You're not going to go in a place which is out in the open because you're worried that someone will see you and it's embarrassing. And at nighttime, you have the benefit of the cover of night. And so therefore you might feel more at liberty to expose yourself out in the open because no one can see you. But a truly modest person says to himself, I'm never alone. God is there. And therefore, even though no human being can see me, I also have to feel a sense of propriety, and therefore you won't expose yourself completely as you might if no one was there. Now, of course, God, it doesn't care whether a person exposes himself or herself or not in front of God, but it's supposed to create that sense of reverence that I'm standing before the King, the Holy of Holies, the King of Kings, and therefore I need to feel that sense of propriety and dignity no matter where I am, no matter what I do. For this reason, the rabbis noted how a person's posture must reflect this. And it's in that spirit that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi in Tractate Kiddushin said, Asur la'adam shiyahalech arba amot b'koma zekufa. It is forbidden for a person to walk 4 cubits, just to take a normal walk for any length of space, and to have his head held up high. There's a certain idea of a person keeping your head down, because when you're in the presence of the king, you don't want to appear to be haughty or holier than thou. Shenamar, as it says in Isaiah, Melo chol haaretz kivodo. The entire world is filled with God's glory. It's the same idea, an awareness that I'm in God's presence. This reminds us that God's presence is with us at all times, even when we are simply walking from here to there. Now, great rabbis would always keep their heads covered. And that very same Gemara in Tractate Kiddushin continues by saying that Rav Huna berei de Rav Yehoshua lo maske arba amot begilui harosh. He would never walk 4 cubits without keeping his head covered. Now, of course, this is where we get the custom of wearing a yarmulke, of wearing a kippah. And it's a minhag, because this was clearly a midat chasidut, this was clearly an act of piety above and beyond the letter of the law. And he used to say, Omar Shechina lema'ala meroshi. He said, the divine presence is above my head. How can I expose myself, even if it's just my scalp? How can I expose myself to God that way? I should feel that sense of modesty that something is over me. Now, of course, when I say that this was just a minhag because it was an act of piety, not required by the letter of the law, I don't want anyone think that there's now an dispensation that you don't need to wear a kippah. Wearing a kippah is codified by the halachic authorities as something that is mandatory and incumbent upon every Jewish male, for reasons that go well beyond the idea of modesty and a sense of humility in standing before God, especially when living in a diasporic community. Identifying oneself as a Jew is especially important. That's why some rabbis feel perhaps it's less of an important thing to do when living in a community in Eretz Yisrael, but I'm not going to go into that now. Suffice it to say that Rav Huna felt that this was a sign of recognition that I'm in the presence of God. This is also why great rabbis would speak very little, knowing that they are in God's presence. And the Rambam says, I've already explained to you in my Mishnah commentary on Pirkei Avot, when the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, Shimon beno Omer, Kol Yamai Gadalti Bein HaChachamim, that my entire life I grew up among the sages. And in learning from them and in realizing how much I could learn from them, Lo matzati laguf tov ela shetika. I found that the healthiest thing for the body is silence, because when a person is silent, he has a certain receptivity to attaining knowledge and wisdom. Velo hamidrashu ha'ikir ela hama'aseh. It is not the study that is the main thing. In other words, don't always focus on how many words you can use to explicate the Torah, but rather deed is the more important thing. V'chol hamarbe devarim mevi chet, and the more that you shmooze, the more that you talk, the more that you bring sin upon you. Now, in that, in his Mishnah commentary, the Rambam has a very lengthy, an uncharacteristically lengthy commentary on this particular Mishnah. And he talks about the evils of certain kinds of speech. Initially, he divides speech into 5 different categories. Some speech which is good, some speech which is truly evil, which is harmful to others, slander and revealing of secrets and so forth. Some speech which is neither good nor evil, but neutral, and some of it which is gratuitous and so forth. And then he launches into a lengthy discussion of some of the evils of speech that he has encountered in his own generation. The big one, of course, is Lashon Hara, where people just simply gossip about each other. And this was a big problem in the Rambam's time, just as it's a problem in our time and probably in almost every generation of Jews. Another thing that he rails against, which is something that's a little bit foreign to us, is that it was very common for Jews to gather into bars. I'm not sure if the word bar is the right word, whether it's a saloon or whether it's a cafe, what we would call it. But people would gather into these spaces where they would be served glasses of wine, and people would spend hours in these places, and they would sing songs, and it was considered to be a sign of great wisdom if you could come up with a nice poem and put it into song, and you would have a minstrel playing, and it provided a lot of joy for people. But at the same time, the Rambam felt that this was a very negative way for a Jew to spend his life. We also find in some of the writings of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, we have some of his poems that he even composed in some of these drinking places. Um, but suffice it to say that the Rambam expresses his great displeasure at this type of speech because he feels, number one, that you're using the Arabic language in an inappropriate way, and if you actually convert the Arabic poetry into Hebrew, that's actually even worse because you're using a holy language for purely mundane and perhaps even less than mundane, inappropriate speech, which gets into talking about male and female relationships and songs about love and so forth and so on. And so these are some of the things that he expresses in his commentary. But the bottom line is that the less speech that a person utilizes, the better off he is. And the Rambam therefore says that that's the whole theme. If a person realizes how much of his daily speech is gratuitous and unnecessary and counterproductive to his project of serving God, he will curtail his speech. Consider, of course, that when you realize that you're in the presence of Hashem, you're only going to want to curtail your speech even more. Because, if you're standing in the presence of a dignitary, you're going to be constantly fearful. Maybe I'm going to say something stupid, and I'm going to make a fool of myself, and I'm going to say something that will be displeasing to this great king who is in my presence. And so, therefore, you keep your speech very limited. And he finally says, to bring this all home, he quotes the pasuk in Ecclesiastes at the beginning of chapter 5. Al tivahel al picha. Don't rush with your mouth. V'libecha al yemaher lahotzi davar lifnei ha'elokim. Don't allow your heart to be quick to produce a word when you're in the presence of God. Ki ha'elokim b'shamayim ve'ata al haaretz, because God is in the heaven and you are here on this earth, and God is scrutinizing you. Al kain yihiyu divarecha me'atim, and therefore your words should be few. Okay, point number 3, which is really the punchline to bring this all home. The objective that I have been discussing up to this point, that is to say, when man realizes that he is in the presence of the King of Kings, his entire demeanor changes, is contained within the performance of the mitzvot, in that all of them were designed to reinforce this thought within man that he is standing before God. And this is the major reveal that the Rambam presents to us in this chapter. The reason why God gave us so many commandments is in order that we constantly reinforce this knowledge that we're supposed to have, that I am standing in the presence of God. Every single mitzvah that God gave us reminds us that I'm standing in God's presence, because if God commands me to wear tzitzit or put on tefillin, it clearly must be because he's aware of who I am and what I'm doing. Every time I engage in the service of God, then I'm reminding myself that I am in the presence of God. And so every single mitzvah that I perform throughout the day, whether it's prayer, whether it's putting on tefillin, whether it's shaking a lulav on Sukkot, every single mitzvah reminds me that I am in the presence of God, whether I make a bracha on a piece of food and so forth. And he says some excellent pious men achieve this when performing the mitzvot habitually. Now, the reason why he says that only some excellent pious men achieve this is because obviously most people will go through the routine of doing mitzvot over the course of the day and won't be as mindful as they should be about the fact that the reason why I'm doing this is because I believe that I'm in the presence of God. Through their performance, they realize that they are in God's presence, these pious men, and are thus filled with a great awe and fear of God. This prompts them to behave in the ways mentioned above. And the fact is that he says that don't take my word for it, says the Rambam. If you look carefully in the psukim in the Torah, you will realize that this is precisely what God says as to why he gave us the mitzvot. So he quotes the verse in Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is in the midst of what's called the Tochacha, in the midst of a section of the Torah where God gives stern rebuke to the Jewish people, letting them know that they stand to face great and grave penalties if they don't follow the ways of God. And if you look at one of the verses there, it says, Im lo tishmor la'asot, et kol divrei haTorah hazot, if you will not be careful to observe all of the words of this Torah, haketuvim basefer hazeh, that are written in this book, in this scroll, liyirat Hashem hanichbad v'hanora hazeh et Hashem Elokecha, to fear the honorable name and the awesome name, that which is your God. And the Rambam reads this verse as follows, that if you do not fulfill the mitzvot, whose purpose is to bring about a fear of God's awesome and honorable name, namely God himself. Because the whole purpose of the mitzvot is to engender that fear and that reverence of God. And a failure to perform those mitzvot will cause you to not be filled with that fear of God that is necessary in order for you to be a proper servant of God. And note, he says, how it says, Im lo tishmor la'asot. Now, there's a double verb there. Tishmor la'asot means if you're not careful to observe. But there's two verbs there. There's shomer, to protect or observe, and la'asot is to do or to perform. And the Rambam says, based on his knowledge of the words of our sages, that tishmor refers to the negative commandments, the mitzvot lo ta'aseh, and la'asot refers to the positive commandment. He's basing this on the teaching, is that whenever the Torah uses a language of hishamer, be careful, or shamor, observe, it's really referring to making sure that you safeguard the negative commandments of the Torah. Don't eat pork. Don't work on the Sabbath. That's shamor. That's protect the negative commandments. But aseh, do, is referring to a performance of the positive commandments in a proactive way. The fact that the Torah has both tishmor and lasot in this verse and associates it with the fear of God means that all 613 commandments, both the 365 negative commandments and the 248 positive commandments, all of them, when taken in toto, are for the purpose of engendering yirat Hashem, are purpose for engendering the fear of God. Now, we're not used to thinking that, and I'll explain why we're not used to thinking that, but the thesis of the Rambam is that the reason why God gave us so many mitzvot is that the more mitzvot I do, the more that my thinking will be reinforced that I am standing in the presence of Hashem. And that will fill me with a sense of reverence and awe of God, and ultimately my behavior will be changed, and I will accomplish one level of the worship of Hashem, which is what we call Yirat Hashem. Because in order for a person to fulfill this intellectual bond with God, a person must be filled with that requisite reverence in order for him to get to the next level. And here's where we get to the next level. And this is the second punchline of this chapter, which is what we call now step number 4. And this is this you might, a person reading this chapter quickly might think that this is just a postscript of the chapter, but it's not. It really is one of the most important points of the chapter. In contrast to the physical mitzvot engendering fear of God, the ideas of the Torah, what is called in Hebrew the deot of the Torah, engender love of God. And the Rambam here divides the Torah into a book that presents us with physical things to do, and a book that provides us with ideas that we need to internalize. Okay? And while some commentaries say that the ideas that we need to internalize is, by definition, Talmud Torah, it appears that that's not the simple reading of the Rambam. The Rambam has been talking about throughout this book, especially now in these final chapters, about how intellectual perfection is accomplished through contemplation of God and his universe, having nothing to do with Torah study, nothing to do with learning Daf Yomi, nothing to do with learning Mishnayos, nothing to do with learning Parshat HaShavua, but rather a philosophical deep dive into an understanding of who and what God is and how he interacts with our universe and the nature of this creation that God has presented to thinking beings. So therefore, the Torah presents us with a list of things that we are to do, and the Torah presents us with a list of thoughts that help us understand God better. The list of things to do engenders a fear of God, Yirat Hashem. The list of ideas that are presented in the Torah about God engender Ahavat Hashem, engender a love of God. And the Rambam says, I've explained this many times to you. You may not have been listening or reading carefully, but this is the point that I made. And we just saw this as recently as 10 pages ago in chapter 51. The Rambam had said, we have made it clear several times that love is proportionate to apprehension. And he says this in the Sefer HaMitzvot. He says this in Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah, in Hilchot Deot. The Rambam writes that the more that one understands God, the more that a person is filled with a great love of Hashem. So the more that I can internalize and contemplate and understand the ideas about God in the Torah, the more that I am filled with a love of Hashem. The Torah stresses this intellectual worship of God, which translates into love with the following statement: Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love the Lord your God b'chol levavecha, uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol me'odecha. Using these three terminologies of levavcha, nafshecha, and me'odecha, with all your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might, means that the Torah is stressing the vitally important project of intellectual in the intellectual internalization of God into your mind. And that is the mitzvah of the Ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, to make it clear in your mind that God is completely unitary, to make it clear in your mind that God is the creator, to make it clear in your mind that God interacts with our universe through a series of emanations, and using philosophical logic and argumentation to come to a complete grasp of God as he is, to the highest level that a human being is capable. In summation, then, love and fear are achieved through two different things. Love is achieved through the intellectual teachings of the Torah, the Deot, which include comprehending God as he truly is. Fear is achieved through performing the mitzvot physically, as we have explained. And that's the end of the chapter. Now, before we let you go, this is quite unique. It is quite novel, in my opinion, the way that the Rambam has presented this information. One of the reasons is because we are used to thinking that a person is filled with both Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem through the mitzvot of the Torah. And this is something that we see in the commentary of the Ramban. The Ramban, in his commentary to Shemot chapter 20, and talking about the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, he says, Emet hu gam kein ki midat zachor ramzu b'mitzvat aseh. You know, there is a discrepancy in the way that the Ten Commandments appear in Parshat Yitro in Exodus versus how they appear in Parshat Va'et Hanan in Deuteronomy. The discrepancy, there are many discrepancies, but one of the discrepancies is that in Parshat Yitro, it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And in Deuteronomy, it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho, protect the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we know our sages tell us that really, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad, that the second time the Ten Commandments are written in the Torah, It's actually just a recapitulation of the way that it was given to the Jews at Sinai. So did God say at Sinai, Zachor, or did he say Shamor? And the answer is that God uttered those two words simultaneously into the ears of Moses, implying that the two were inexorably intertwined. That there are positive aspects of the Sabbath, which is Zachor. Like, for example, the Talmud says, Zochreu al hayayin, you sanctify the Sabbath day through your words and through your recital of Kiddush. And Shamor, you have to protect the Sabbath day by making sure that you do not do melacha, that you do not do labor, you do not perform labor on the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath is a hybridization of both positive things that I do to sanctify the day and protecting the sanctity of the day by not doing certain negative things that will distract me from the peacefulness and restfulness of the Shabbat. Now, with that being the case, the Ramban says that Sabbath observance almost acts as an exemplar of all the mitzvot of the Torah. And he writes that all positive commandments are there to engender ahavat Hashem, the love of God, and all negative commandments, making sure that I am reverent enough not to trespass beyond God's wishes, that engenders yirat Hashem. And I would encourage you to go through that commentary. The Ramban is more conventional, I guess what you would say in the mind of the Jew, is that the mitzvot in their totality engender both ahavat Hashem through the positive things I do, through prayer, through building a sukkah, through eating matzah, I show my devotion and love for Hashem, and not eating pork and not violating Shabbat show my reverence and fear of God because I'm worried that I should offend him in some way by doing something wrong. But it would seem that the Rambam disagrees fundamentally with this, since, as we've explained a number of times, the primary source of connection is not through physical action for the Rambam, but rather it is through the intellect. Therefore, the performance of mitzvot, while of value, have only secondary value to the ideas of the Torah, just as fear is secondary to love of God. We know that the highest, the apex of connection and worship of God is love, ahava. Fear is a lower level of connection to God because it makes me reverent and obedient to God, but it doesn't put me in that loving relationship. Just like in human relationships, the lower level of relationship is the intimidation that an employee feels for his boss, but there's no bond of closeness. There's not even necessarily a full loyalty. As once the boss turns his back, I may not behave the same way. But love is, I love my spouse, let's say, so much that even when she's not present, I would not want to do anything that would be offensive to her. And so that's the way the Rambam frames this. The mitzvot, the physical performance of the commandments, lower level. It brings me to the ability to be able to contemplate God completely through the ideas of the Torah, and that's the ultimate level of connection and worship of God. Again, revolutionary, radical, in that the Ma'aseh HaMitzvot is really just a means to a higher ends. But if you're at this point in the guide, this should not be shocking to you. Maybe if you're learning this chapter in a standalone by itself without looking at the rest of Moreh Nevukhim, this is surprising. But based on everything that we've learned up until now, there's nothing shocking about this statement. Just finally, how will the Rambam interpret the verse V'haya im shamoa tishmuel mitzvotai, of the second paragraph of Shema, which appears in Parshat Ekev in Deuteronomy? The Torah says, if you will hearken to my commandments, asher anuchi mitzaveh etchem, that I am commanding you today. God is clearly discussing the physical mitzvot, is he not? And then he says, le'ahavat Hashem Elokechem u'la'avdo, to love God and to serve him, v'chol levavchem u'v'chol nafshechem, with all your heart and with all your soul. So it's not really clear if the Rambam feels that the purpose of the mitzvot is to attain a yirah of Hashem. How can the Torah in the same breath say that the purpose of the mitzvot is le'ahavat Hashem Elokechem? So the Rambam may have to finesse this. One of the ways you could read this is to bifurcate the verse and basically say it's talking about two different things. If you hearken unto my commandments and you observe them properly, this will fill you with a sense of awe of God. And this will ultimately bring you to a love of God, because you will have the ability to fully comprehend the ideas that are conveyed by the Torah. It's a progression. And then if you are able to reach that ultimate level of Ahavat Hashem, then you will receive all of the rewards that are contained in that paragraph of the Shema. Just something to think about as we leave for today. But I think there were a number of questions that were presented here. I'm just going to stop the share for a moment so that we can take a look at some of the questions. Let me just see here. Michael says, since we are always in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the Rambam suggesting that we should always act the same if we want to have the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Well, the same in the sense that there should always be that sense of absolute reverence and modesty and embarrassment. Yes, that's what he is suggesting. But it's for the purpose of bringing us to the highest level, which is the love of God. But there has to be that modicum of fear, that modicum of reverence, because I'm always, through that knowledge that I am always in the presence of Hashem. Okay, any other points before we let you go for the day? Have a wonderful week. We will continue Be'ezrat Hashem with chapter 53 next time, and we'll see you then. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.